While the cameras showed King Charles and Queen Camilla smiling side by side in Scotland, sources inside the palace were describing something far darker. A marriage under pressure, a monarchy divided, and a king who has chosen Harry over everyone. That smile, that wave, that perfectly staged image of unity on the steps of St. Giles's Cathedral in Edinburgh on the 1st of July, 2026. It was everything the palace wanted the world to see. The king in his ceremonial dress, the queen standing close at his side, the flags snapping in the Scottish wind. The guards in their ancient livery, the stone walls of the cathedral rising behind them like a structure built to outlast every human drama ever played out beneath its shadow. Everything looked exactly the way the palace needed it to look, composed, permanent, undivided. But here is what you didn't see. Here is what no camera was permitted to capture, no official statement chose to address, and no courtier with any instinct for self-preservation would dare confirm on the record. Behind that image, behind that impeccably timed smile, behind the practiced wave directed at a crowd that had been carefully managed, something had already changed inside the British monarchy that no photograph and no ceremony can put back. Something that has been building in the spaces between official appearances, gathering pressure in the private rooms that cameras never reach, has finally broken through the surface in a way that is visible to everyone who is paying close enough attention. And the people who live and work closest to the throne are paying very close attention indeed. King Charles III has made a decision, not a small one, not the kind of decision that gets dressed up in ceremonial language and fed to the press through a carefully coordinated briefing, not the sort of thing that ends up buried in the court circular where almost nobody reads it, and even fewer remember it a week later. A decision that has fractured the inner circle of the most famous and most scrutinized family on earth, placed the king in direct and open opposition to both his heir and his consort at precisely the same moment, and set in motion a chain of consequences that even the most experienced and battle-hardened royal observers are struggling to trace to their likely conclusions. He has chosen to bring Prince Harry back, not back in the full institutional sense, not back with titles reinstated and formal duties assigned and the grinding machinery of the firm cranking back into motion around him, back in the human sense, back in the family sense, back as his son, present and acknowledged, and no longer separated from his father by the wall that the last 3 years of rupture constructed between them. Charles has decided that wall needs to come down, and in making that decision, he has chosen Harry over William. He has chosen Harry over Camilla. He has chosen Harry over the hard-won, imperfect, quietly fragile peace that has kept the Windsor family from another very public unraveling for the better part of 3 years. The question that is circulating now, in private offices and hushed corridors and careful conversations that happen far beyond what any press release will ever acknowledge, is not whether Charles made this decision. That is beyond dispute. He did. The real question is what it is going to cost, and whether Charles has genuinely confronted how steep and personal and lasting that cost is going to be. And to understand the full weight of what is happening, you have to go back and understand what the palace has been carefully, deliberately, and successfully pretending for the last 2 years. Since Harry and Meghan stepped away from royal life in a manner that managed to feel simultaneously planned and chaotic since the Netflix documentary arrived and used the family's own history as its primary script. Since Spare appeared in bookshops and became one of the most discussed and most consequential royal books in living memory. Since the television interviews that reached into rooms the institution had spent decades presenting as private and inviolable. Since all of that, there has been a fundamental and unspoken agreement at the center of the Windsor family. Harry was the problem. Harry was the one who left when the institution demanded loyalty above all else. Harry was the one who spoke when the code of the firm made silence not just expected, but essentially compulsory. He handed the world a view of the interior of a family and an institution that had always relied, at a deep structural level, on the world not being able to see clearly inside it. And the agreement, implicit, never formalized, but universally understood by everyone operating near the throne, was that distance from Harry was the price of institutional stability, and that stability was worth whatever it cost in terms of the king's private grief over the rupture with his youngest son. William believed this entirely and without reservation. Camilla understood it and accepted it as sound institutional logic. The palace's professional apparatus of advisors and communications directors and private secretaries built their planning around it. And Charles appeared, for a considerable period, to have reluctantly made his peace with it, as the only realistic path forward for a monarchy that needed to project unity and coherence above all else. But Charles has cancer. That fact, the single most human and irreducible fact sitting at the very center of all of this, changes everything that surrounds it. When a man receives a diagnosis like the one Charles received, when mortality stops being an abstract and distant concept and becomes something measurable and present and impossible to look away from, priorities reorganize themselves with a speed and a force that no amount of institutional protocol can redirect or contain. Duties that once felt urgent become suddenly smaller. Grievances that once seemed worth maintaining start to feel like a form of self-indulgence that a person in his position can no longer justify. The relationships that were pushed aside because the timing was never quite right, the words that were left unsaid because the moment never arrived, those things move to the very front of a man's consciousness in a way that is nearly impossible to resist or rationalize away. Charles does not want to die with Harry on the other side of a wall that he helped construct, and that he still has the authority and the time to dismantle. He does not want the final pages of his reign to read as the chronicle of a family fracture that the entire world watched deepen in real time and that he stood by and allowed to harden into something permanent. He wants Harry back. Not back in a formal sense, not back with the full pageantry of a royal rehabilitation. Simply back, in the room, at the table, connected to his father in the way that sons and fathers are supposed to be connected. His son? I mean, that want, that deeply personal, deeply fatherly, entirely human want, is precisely the thing that is tearing the palace apart right now in ways that the Edinburgh photographs were never going to show. Sources close to the situation, speaking to publications including Heat World and confirmed across multiple senior royal correspondents who have spent years covering this family, have described the atmosphere inside the palace in terms that are almost impossible to reconcile with the composed and dignified images emerging from Scotland. William and Camilla, two people who have spent years positioned on opposite sides of nearly every internal palace tension, who have navigated their own complicated relationship within the institution with considerable mutual wariness, are now standing on exactly the same ground. They are aligned, they are coordinated, and they are opposed to Charles's plan with a conviction that those close to them describe as firm and unlikely to soften with time. They share the belief that Harry cannot be trusted, that Meghan's sustained influence over him transforms any potential reconciliation from a calculated institutional risk into something closer to a near-certain disaster, and that welcoming the Sussexes back into any degree of proximity to the family, even informally, even privately, even on the most carefully controlled terms imaginable, is an act of institutional self-destruction that has simply been repackaged in the appealing language of family healing. Now, the language that insiders are using to characterize the positions of William and Camilla is not the restrained and diplomatic language that royal communications professionals spend their careers cultivating and deploying. One source close to the inner circle described what Charles is proposing as complete lunacy. Another confirmed that William has delivered warnings to his father on this subject on more occasions than can be easily counted, and that he remains deeply, persistently, and openly angry at what he characterizes as a pattern of unilateral decisions to extend goodwill toward a brother who has consistently demonstrated that access to the family will ultimately be converted into narrative, into legal action, into commercially distributed, grievance-targeted. At audiences that have the least sympathy for the institution, William has dedicated his life to protecting and modernizing. Camilla's position, according to those with knowledge of conversations at that level, is equally firm even if the reasoning behind it has its own particular texture. She has made her concerns clear to Charles in private. She has done so without ambiguity. She is not remotely enthusiastic about the direction he is taking. She reads the risk with the precision and the grimness of someone who has lived through enough media cycles to understand exactly how quickly and how completely carefully constructed public images can be dismantled when the wrong story takes hold of the news environment. And she knows, with a certainty that comes from painful personal experience, that the Sussex story is the most powerful single narrative capable of doing that to her. But Charles is not turning back. Multiple sources characterize his current position with a telling and consistent phrase. He has dug his heels in. He believes, and this belief appears, by all accounts, to be unshakable, that the sustained, ongoing, deeply public estrangement between Harry and the rest of the Windsor family is doing cumulative and serious damage to the monarchy, with every month that passes without resolution. He believes that a reunion, however imperfect, however politically costly in terms of internal palace relationships, is a more defensible legacy than a permanent fracture that the entire watching world can measure and reference and discuss. He believes that when history eventually writes its verdict on this chapter of the monarchy's long story, it will not be the state visits or the constitutional management or the charity patronages that define the judgment. It will be whether a father, given the time and the authority to repair something broken, chose to use it. He is willing to absorb the consequences, even the consequence of standing largely alone in a palace full of people who believe he is making the most significant mistake of his reign. Well, what this creates is something genuinely unprecedented in the modern history of the British royal family. There are historical precedents in abundance for monarchs at odds with their parliaments, their governments, their churches, their publics, The history of the crown is in large part a history of those specific tensions and how they were navigated. But a reigning monarch simultaneously in open conflict with his heir and his consort over the question of an exiled younger son, that specific configuration has no precedent. There is no file in the royal archives that anyone can reference. There is no institutional memory that applies neatly to this particular combination of people and stakes and consequences. The palace is navigating territory that has never been mapped before. Neat things. And the entire world is watching the navigation attempt in real time. Royal commentators who have spent decades covering this family have described what is currently happening as a defining moment, not just for the character of Charles' personal reign, but for the institution's long-term credibility and direction. One observer, speaking with unusual and almost startling directness, summarized the stakes across 3 precise and telling phrases. This is a massive humiliation for William, a huge victory for Harry, and a gigantic political gamble for the king. All 3 verdicts coexist without contradiction, and all 3 carry consequences that extend far beyond whatever is said in the next family conversation behind palace walls. William's position in this story deserves particular and sustained attention, because it is considerably more layered than the surface image of a stubborn older brother refusing to let a grudge go. William is not simply a sibling in this situation. He is the Prince of Wales. He is the man who will one day assume the position Charles currently holds, who will carry the full institutional weight of the monarchy forward into a future that will test it in ways nobody can fully anticipate. Every decision the current king makes has direct implications for what William is going to inherit. When William watches his father choosing to rehabilitate Harry's standing within the family, he is not witnessing a private domestic decision being made by an aging parent. He is watching the King of England lend the authority of his office to a man who spent years using access to the institution as the raw material for public grievance, legal strategy, and commercial content targeted at the audiences most hostile to everything William is trying to build. William has invested himself in Catherine and the image of the Wales family in a long-term project to keep the monarchy relevant and respected in an age increasingly skeptical of inherited privilege and ancient institutions. The prospect of Harry's return is not a family matter for William. It is a strategic threat to the most important work he has ever done. Required everything she had. And it required, at a foundational level, the gradual fading of the Sussex story from the center of the media's attention. Harry's return, even in its most informal and private conceivable form, does not allow that fading to continue. It reverses it. It drags forward every aspect of the history that Camilla's painstaking image work has been slowly moving into the background. Every profile written about the Sussex return will be written against a backdrop that includes everything Camilla would prefer the public to have moved beyond. She knows this, and she has told Charles she knows this, and he has proceeded anyway. On that proceeding, that refusal to be redirected by the people who have the most standing to redirect him, is perhaps the most quietly revelatory aspect of this entire situation. Here is a man who spent most of his public life being managed and advised and shaped by the institution he was eventually going to lead. A man who waited with a patience that sometimes seemed almost inhuman for his moment to arrive. A man who understood for most of his adult life that the role required a particular discipline, the discipline of putting the crown's needs above his own, the institution's requirements above his preferences, the long view above the immediate and the personal. That same man is now king, and he is making decisions that are entirely and unapologetically his own. Not the institution's decisions, not the press office's decisions, not the heir's preferred decisions or the consort's carefully communicated ones. His. The decisions of a father who has concluded that being a father is the most important thing left to him, and who is prepared to stand alone in that conclusion if that is what it requires. The Scotland visit served as an inadvertent public window into all of this invisible internal tension. The Order of the Thistle service at St. Giles's Cathedral on July the 1st was, in its official framing, exactly the kind of event that the monarchy produces most naturally and most convincingly. Ancient, ceremonial, solemn. Charles as the sovereign of the order, Camilla positioned beside him with the practiced ease of someone who has stood. In these arrangements, hundreds of times William present with the controlled expression of a man who understands perfectly well what these occasions require of him. The full weight of Scotland's oldest chivalric tradition performing itself for the cameras and for the nation, and for whatever sense of continuity the nation still draws from these performances. But outside the cathedral, the other reality of the monarchy in July 2026 was also on display. Protesters held signs reading, "Not my king." Others carried placards asking, "What did you know?" Pointed directly at the shadow of Prince Andrew and the Epstein scandal that stripped him of his last remaining royal titles and left him as a kind of permanent, uncomfortable presence at the edges of the family's public story. These protests were not, in their immediate intention, about Harry or about the Sussex question or about the internal tension that has been the subject of the last several days of royal coverage. But protest that arrives at a royal ceremony is never entirely contained by its stated purpose. It becomes a referendum, a question about whether this institution, with all of its complexity and its internal contradictions and its human failings, continues to justify the position it occupies. And that question, hanging in the air outside St. Giles's Cathedral on a July afternoon, is the same question that Charles's decision about Harry is making impossible to defer. What comes next in practical terms remains genuinely and uncomfortably uncertain. A Sussex visit to the United Kingdom is being actively arranged. Accommodation and security support are being organized, reportedly at the King's direct instigation. William will not receive this with grace. Camilla will maintain the public face her position demands, while privately remaining opposed to the entire trajectory. The palace will release whatever carefully worded statement the moment eventually requires, calibrated to acknowledge as little of the actual internal conflict as the situation allows, and the cameras will photograph what they are positioned to photograph and interpret what they are permitted to see. But the photographs cannot show what has genuinely changed. They cannot capture what it means that Charles has placed himself in opposition to both his wife and his heir over a decision about the son who left. They cannot convey what William is carrying in the space between his public composure and his private fury. They cannot show what Camilla is processing behind the steady expression. She has spent decades learning to maintain in circumstances far more personally costly than this. What the photographs show is the surface. The surface is what the monarchy has always been best at producing. It is the thing beneath the surface, the actual human reality of the people performing these ancient rites in the middle of a family crisis of their own making, that never quite makes it into the frame. The British monarchy has survived 800 years of war and plague and constitutional rupture and personal scandal and collective grief on a national scale. It has survived things that should, by ordinary institutional logic, have ended it. It will survive this too, in all likelihood, but the people inside it will not survive it unchanged. William will carry whatever this moment means to him forward into the reign he's eventually going to lead, and it will shape him in ways that won't become fully visible for years. Camilla will continue to navigate a marriage that has just been clarified in at least this dimension as a partnership in which the most consequential decisions are ultimately made by one person acting on his own terms. And Harry, wherever he is, taking stock of what has just been communicated to him from the very top of the family he left, has just received something he has been waiting for, proof that his father will fight for him, that the wall is coming down, that the choice was made in his favor. What he does with that proof, and what it ultimately costs the family he is being invited back into, is the question that the next chapter of this story is going to answer. Pictures that monarchies produce. They are exceptionally good at showing you what the institution needs you to believe. They are constitutionally incapable of showing you what is actually happening inside the people who live inside it. That is the story behind the smile from Edinburgh. That is what the cameras couldn't show you. A man running out of time, making the most human decision of his reign, and a palace holding its breath to discover what that decision is truly going to cost everyone who lives inside it.